Breathing in the Death Zone, Tales from the Summit of Everest. Let me, if I can, just recite for you the paragraph that was provided to me by our keynote this evening, Rak Patel, who's an associate professor of orthopedic surgery and a spine service chief at the University of Michigan. He writes, on May 23rd, 2019, I was fortunate enough to summit Mount Everest. I was expecting the climb to be physically challenging, but was taken aback by the mental aspect of such an undertaking. Even though this had been a childhood dream of mine, I don't think I would have been able to achieve it without the emotional training which resulted from many trials and tribulations in my work and personal life. The resilience I developed as a surgeon in residency and as an attending was critical in my success. Additionally, my personal experiences with depression provided me the tools needed to weather the lows during this trip. In fact, at midnight on May 23rd, when we set off on our summit bid, I focused on my breath, not only to get oxygen to my body, but also to cope with the pain from 2 fresh rib fractures and manage the anxiety of being directly confronted with death. Returning from my trip, I had renewed perspective on my purpose in life. Integral to this was recognizing the importance of work-life balance and addressing the issue of burnout in healthcare providers. Friends, I present to you Rak Patel. Rak, thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Mo, for having me. I really appreciate it. And thanks for everyone to join on this talk. Hang on one second while I try to share my screen. Great. Is that working on your end?
It is, thanks.
Fantastic. So today I'm going to talk to you about breathing in the death zone. So breathing is a very interesting thing. We all obviously have to do it to survive, but we don't really give much thought to it. Sometimes if you're running or if you're mountain biking, you can feel a little bit winded and get out of breath. Also occasionally, if you're going skiing in like Breckenridge or the Canadian Rockies, when you get off the ski lift, you can feel like slightly out of breath and slightly winded. But none of this manifests itself as true distress. And I think the first time I ever felt distress in my breath was when I got to base camp at Mount Everest at 17,500 feet. Now, I had been a lot higher in the past before on other mountain climbs, but I think going from 0 feet of altitude in Ann Arbor to 17,500 feet at base camp in about 10 days kind of set me up for this difficulty in breathing. So this is a picture of base camp, and this is a frequent sight. This is my tent with the light on. And for the first couple of weeks, I didn't sleep because I suffered from periodic breathing. So what that essentially is because of the hypoxia, when I would fall asleep, I would hyperventilate. And it would be an exaggerated response out of proportion to the hypoxia. So I'd blow off all the carbon dioxide and I would lose my respiratory drive and I would stop breathing for several seconds. And clinically what that results in is me waking up and jumping out of my sleeping bag, gasping for air and kind of reaching to pull away any clothing around my neck. I would fall back asleep and the same cycle would repeat itself, which made for a lot of sleepless nights over the first week or 2 of the trip. And I was obviously concerned because if this was happening to me at 17,500 feet, what was going to happen to me at 29,000 feet on the top of the mountain? So in climbing, we commonly refer to this magical barrier at 8,000 meters as a death zone. So the Wikipedia definition of the death zone is a certain point above which there's not enough oxygen to sustain human life. And this point is 8,000 meters. There are 14 8,000 meter peaks in the world, and they're all located in the Himalaya. And Everest is by far the tallest at 8,848 meters. So I chose to climb Mount Everest by the southern route. And essentially this is done by establishing 4 camps, with the 4th camp being above 8,000 meters at the death zone. And most climbers follow essentially the same protocol. You take about 8 weeks to climb Mount Everest, and from base camp, you successively climb higher and then come back down and rest and acclimatize. And on your final rotation, you summit. And the whole goal is by the end of the 8 weeks when you're finally trying to summit, you want to have maximized your amount of acclimatization and your strength so you can reach the top and come down safely and successfully. So this was my view from Camp 3 at 23,500 feet, just 2 days before my proposed summit. I enjoyed an amazing dinner with this beautiful view and absolutely stunning weather. I went to sleep on oxygen, and this is the first time we actually used bottled oxygen. And even at a low flow rate, the oxygen made a huge difference in the kind of restful sleep I was getting. I woke up in the morning and I was really excited about the day ahead, climbing into the death zone, going into Camp 4. However, when I was packing up my backpack, I had this fit of coughing. And I felt this sharp pain on the right side of my chest, and I heard an audible snap. And I realized right away that I broke a rib. I went outside and I went and found my lead guide. It was about 5 in the morning. We were just getting ready to go. And I said, "Hey, Ben, I think I just broke my rib." And he simply said, "Do you want to go down or go up?" And at this point in time, I had spent years dreaming about this, and I was 2 days away for the summit. So without hesitation, I said, "I'm going up." So we started along this climb, and I was probably one of the stronger members of my team throughout this entire expedition, but I quickly fell behind everybody. So here's a picture of a bunch of climbers and my team going across the yellow band, which is a landmark on Everest, going from Camp 3 to Camp 4, and I fell hours behind. And I fell behind for several reasons. I couldn't move my right arm because of the pain from a fresh rib fracture. And regardless of how much oxygen I had flown in my mask, I was splinting and I couldn't take a deep breath, so my body couldn't use any of the oxygen I was breathing in. I finally arrived at high camp, and I arrived at high camp hours after everybody else did. I was physically beat and emotionally defeated, and I just crawled into my tent that night. After crawling into my tent, I got a couple of hours of sleep, and I woke up in the morning. And I'm in the red, and my climbing partner is in the blue, and he's an interventional radiologist. And in this discussion, we're talking about a med kit and the availability of an angiocath and the possible need to do a decompression of my lung if I developed a tension pneumo. So we set off into the night to try to summit, and I had a lot of thoughts on my mind, a lot of questions. And the first question, which is the obvious one, is, will I be able to breathe? I struggled at 17,500 feet, and how would I do at 29,000 feet? Also, would I be able to physically breathe? Less than 24 hours ago, I just broken one rib, to my knowledge, at that point in time. Would I be able to physically take a breath? The second thing is, would I be able to use my breath to calm me down? I know that myself and others will often close your eyes and take a deep breath in a stressful moment so you can be present and focused. I routinely do this in surgery, and I do this in life in general. And I knew that there would be a lot of emotional challenges that I would face that I'd never seen before. And would I be able to use my breath to control my emotions? And lastly, was I resilient enough to succeed? So rewind 1 year, I'm sitting kind of right where I am right now in my house in Ann Arbor, altitude 0 feet, and I'm scheming my trip to Mount Everest. So what did I really know about Everest? Kind of what most people know. I read Into Thin Air by John Krakauer. I watched all the TV documentaries, and I climbed quite a bit, and I met some guides that had climbed Everest, and I would pick their brain and ask them questions about Everest every single opportunity that I had. So essentially, from these three sources, I surmised this list of things that was going to require for me to climb Mount Everest. I knew that I was going to have to accept that it was going to be hard, that I was going to get sick and injured somewhere along the 10-week journey. I was going to be emotionally challenged. I would see death, and I would also have to accept the fact that not everyone succeeds. So what makes me think that I could succeed in a climb where professional climbers have died? My first climbing experience was probably roughly in 2007 at Mount Rainier. On Mount Rainier, when I went to Mount Rainier, I was 50 pounds heavier. I used to power lift, and I couldn't run more than a mile. And I went alone, and I met a random group of people who were climbing with RMI, which is a local guide service. And there were roughly 30 people, and everybody was way more qualified to climb that mountain than I was. Most people had climbed before, and everyone else was some form of an endurance athlete, either a triathlete, a runner, a cyclist. And when we set off for the summit of Mount Rainier at midnight, I realized that I was the least qualified person. I had very low expectations for myself making the summit. Several hours later, when the sun came up and we were standing on top of the summit, it was just me and 3 other people standing on the summit. So more than 25 other people who were way more qualified than me didn't make it to the top. So why was that? Why was I able to make it when they couldn't? And I think the answer is in resilience. Whenever people ask me what my strongest trait is, I always tell them that my best talent is the fact that I have this incredible capacity to suffer. And I think, phrased more eloquently, it's that I'm resilient. I have the capacity to respond to stress in a healthy way, such that goals are achieved at a minimal psychological and physical cost. Was I born resilient? I'm sure that genetics and hereditary factors play some role, but I think that most of it is environmental variables. I grew up in a household with immigrant parents, and no matter what I go through in my life, it doesn't come close to the struggles that they face coming to this country trying to make it and raise two kids at that. So watching them go through their stresses certainly helped me develop some resilience. I also grew up in Queens, New York, in the late 80s, early 90s. And this is when the crack epidemic was going on. We didn't grow up in an affluent neighborhood, and from my living room window, I could see drug deals happening around the corner. So I think all these micro stressors throughout my life helped me develop resilience. But I think the biggest stressor that I have is that I'm a doctor. Being a doctor is incredibly stressful. You're being pulled in a million directions. And even though it's a privilege to take care of people, it's also extremely stressful to have someone's life and livelihood in your hands. And the most stressful thing is residency. And I realized that when I reflect back on what it takes to be successful in residency, is it's a very similar list of what it takes to be successful in climbing Mount Everest. I knew residency was going to be hard and it was going to take a long time. I knew that I'd be emotionally challenged and I was going to make mistakes. And I knew my mistakes would affect others. I would see death, and not everyone succeeds. And I could genuinely say, if it wasn't for the resiliency that I developed in residency, I don't think I would have successfully been able to navigate Mount Everest. So traumatic stressors are events that are outside the range of usual human experience that would be markedly distressing to almost anyone. And I think we normalize what we do as surgeons. So everyone leaves their house to go to work in the morning. They kiss their loved ones goodbye and they go to work. Most people go to office-style jobs or manual labor jobs, but we actually go into the operating room. We put on scrubs and someone hands us a knife. We cut people open. Our hands are inside their bodies. We're immersed in blood. We close them back up and we go home as if nothing ever happened. We normalize this whole experience. And I think it's safe to say that this is a traumatic stressor. This is not a usual human experience. And this experience would be markedly distressing to almost anyone. And if you have the correct resources to cope with this traumatic stressor, you can develop a great deal of resilience. I think the problem is that a lot of people don't have the resources to deal with this, either individual resources or community or institutional resources. And this is why we see extremely high rates of post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and burnout amongst physicians. And some studies show reports up to 2/3 of physicians will deal with these issues at some point in their lives. And that's astronomical. So when we talk about physician resilience, I think 3 factors are really important to becoming resilient. One is individual skills and traits. The second is having a great community. And the third is having institutional support. So when we talk about resilient individuals, we talk about people that put themselves out there and try new things. They admit they're not perfect. They fail a lot. They share a lot and they admit to their errors. And they're also very compassionate and forgiving to themselves. And I think what helps us become resilient individuals, a lot of it has to do with the households and the environments that we've been raised in. Additionally, we need a great community. So in residency, my community were my fellow residents who were my best friends back then and have continued to be so. And currently, my community consists of Ilias, who's on the panel, and other spine surgeons, both at my institution and nationally. Also, I've been really fortunate to work for institutions like NYU and the University of Michigan, which have been really supportive in helping me deal with some of the stressors that we all face in life. So fast forward through residency, I'm a junior attending, and I have a case. It's a 53-year-old male with cervical myelopathy and cervical stenosis. My second case canceled, and I only had one case. I figured this would be a quick case, and I was actually planning a rock climbing trip right after this, and I was going to leave early. I do the cervical laminectomy, and all of a sudden, I'm told that we lost signals in this patient's arms and legs. The patient woke up with a spinal cord injury, and I had to go to the family and tell them that their loved one who walked into the hospital was not going to be able to walk out. Now, I found this extremely difficult to cope with, and I really struggled with this. So how did I deal with this situation? Well, in terms of individual factors, I think the most important thing for me was to find meaning in this scenario. And what that entailed was figuring out what happened. So I really analyzed this case from top to bottom. And I sought to find certain things that I could do to prevent this from happening again. I was also really lucky to have a great community of friends and surgeons who not only told me it was okay to have a complication, but shared with me their own personal complications that were very similar. And even more importantly, shared with me the emotional toll that it took on them. And this was critical in helping me get through this. Also, the university was very supportive in supporting me during this time. So I went through this and my career went on great. I did really great complex spine cases. I published, I was well regarded in the hospital and also nationally, and things were going just fine, right? And then fast forward to end of 2015, beginning of 2016, I found that I was losing joy in the things that I really enjoyed. So playing with my, at that time, 6-year-old daughter, it was something I just couldn't bring myself to do. Working out, which is really important for me in my life, I just couldn't, find enough energy to work out. And the spiral continued, and it got to the point where I couldn't even get up out of bed to go to work. And most people just viewed it as me becoming more distant and less engaged in things around me. But in retrospect, this was probably the beginning of my first major depressive episode. And the usual coping mechanisms I've had, which is dealing with the community that I had made at work, it really wasn't helping me get through this. I think people had the best intentions, but they couldn't relate to me. And I found that I was drifting further away. I once again tried to find meaning in this depressive episode as a way to get out of it. And in order to do that, I spoke to many people. I spoke to monks, priests, and rabbis to try to find the meaning of life. And I genuinely appreciate their insight and their time, but nothing really related to me. And it wasn't until a select group of people who I knew almost peripherally, not even so close, came up to me and said, "We know what you're going through. We've seen it before and we've gone through it ourselves." And I can't tell you how invaluable forming this new community was for me and guided me to get out of this depressive episode. There was one night where I was sleeping on my couch with my usual cocktail of sedatives because that's the only thing that could put me to bed. And my phone rang. So I looked at my phone and there was a text at 4:45 in the morning. And it's an odd text because there wasn't a name associated with the number. So I don't know who it came from. But it said, "You're an amazing person and the world is better with you in it." And this is really timely because at this point in time, I was really questioning whether I wanted to go on in this world or not. And I, unlike Ilias, am not a very religious person. But I took this as a sign from the universe that there is some purpose for me to be in it. And with the support of this new community that I made, and with the support of my institution, I was able to take the steps that I needed to get out of this dark tunnel and find some light at the end of it. So in 2016, I couldn't get out of bed. So the summit of Mount Everest was a distant thought at that point in time. Fast forward 2 years, with the help of my friends, I got to the point where I was finally ready to tackle this lifelong dream. So in June of 2018, I signed up to climb Mount Everest. And I really trained hard for it. I would do stairs at the big house in Michigan to kind of simulate altitude, even though I live in the Midwest. I would do workouts and lunges with a weighted vest to strengthen my legs. And probably more importantly, I'd go running in the polar vortex when it was -10 degrees, and I would cycle through rainstorms. Not just to develop the physical strength, but also the emotional reserves and resilience that I knew I would need to summit Everest. I climbed a lot. So this concept of just being able to be physically fit and summit Everest, I don't think it's really accurate. I'm a climber, and I climbed in the Pacific Northwest and did multi-pitch ice climbs. I went to Chamonix and did some technical mixed climbing so I could be comfortable with the terrain. And finally, in March 25th, I felt that I was emotionally and physically ready to tackle Everest. So I flew from Ann Arbor, altitude 0, to Kathmandu, and pretty quickly flew to Lukla, which is a starting point for the trek to base camp. And from there, we began this 10-day trek to base camp. And I know the purpose of the 10-day trek, honestly, is to slowly acclimatize. But for me, the biggest purpose of this trek was to meet and to bond with my fellow climbers on my team. So this would be my new community. And this community could relate to the stresses that I was going to experience on Everest. And I could genuinely say, if it wasn't for the support of these people, I wouldn't have been able to climb Mount Everest. And base camp was fun. We bonded by playing horseshoes. I think this is the highest recorded game of horseshoes ever at 17,500 feet with the Khumbu Ice Fall in the background. I became the base camp barber, and I would take liberties in giving people different haircuts. And eventually we got to climbing. Going from base camp to Camp 1, you go through the Khumbu Ice Fall, which is a stunning place, but also incredibly frightening. It's essentially a bunch of blocks of ice precariously positioned and constantly moving. And we all had different strengths and weaknesses on the team. For example, some people were terrified of climbing vertical ice. Some people were terrified of ledges. I myself was not a fan of crossing ladders. And we and this new form community helped each other out get through these stresses. So here's a picture of a ladder over a crevasse, and this is kind of one of the most stressful things for me. But with the help of my friends, I was able to overcome a lot of these ladders. So we got to Camp 1, and from Camp 1, we proceeded to Camp 2 up the Western Coombe. And at 21,500 feet, this is where you really feel the altitude. On the right are two of my teammates with excruciating headaches at Camp 2. And then from Camp 2, you have the Lhotse face, which is just absolutely beautiful. And you climb the Lhotse face to get to Camp 3. And this is a picture I showed in the beginning, and this is where my talk started. So not only did I have a fresh rib fracture the morning I left Camp 3, but also there's something else going on. This year in 2019, the weather window was very short. What that means is typically there are about 10 days where you can summit Mount Everest. In 2019, this weather window was really shortened because of abnormal weather conditions. So instead of having 10 days where all the climbers can summit, there were only about 3 to 5 days. Contrary to what the media showed, there were roughly the same number of climbers on Everest in 2019 as there were the decade before. But if you take 300 climbers and you shorten the weather window from 10 days to 3 days, you're going to have a lot more people trying to go for the summit on the same day. Additionally, people were pushing themselves really hard so they could thread the needle and make this weather window. And that led to a lot of complications. So this is a picture of people going up the yellow band, and you can see that there's a long line and there's a crowd, obviously, but people are absolutely exhausted, walking with their heads down and even sitting down. Like I said at the beginning of the talk, fell way behind the rest of my team going from Camp 3 to Camp 4 because of my rib fractures. And on the way to the Geneva Spur, which is that big rock band you see in front of you, was my first encounter with fresh death. On the left-hand side, you can see an Indian climber who had passed away. Now, this person was on a similar mission as me, but passed away as a result of altitude and hypoxia. I finally made it to Camp 4, and I was exhausted, as I said, and I was physically and emotionally drained. And I really questioned whether I wanted to be in the mountain, if it was worth it. This individual that had died had a family just like I had parents just like I had, and was it really worth dying to stand on top of Mount Everest? There were a lot of people that wanted to summit that day. And usually most people leave for the summit at roughly 10 p.m. The whole goal is to reach the summit when the sun is rising. But because there were a large number of people, most of the teams were starting earlier and earlier, trying to leapfrog each other. So teams are essentially leaving on the half an hour starting at 6 p.m. So 6 p.m., 6:30, 7 p.m., so on and so forth. So rather than try to leapfrog everyone, my team took a different approach. We decided to leave after midnight, way after everyone else. Hopefully the pros would be that we would not have much traffic, but the risk of that is later in the day, the weather gets worse. So we may encounter some bad weather. This is a picture that one of my friends took with summited the day earlier from Camp 3, and you can see the string of headlights going up towards the summit. We were way after all of these people. So our gamble paid off, and we had a lot of the mountain to ourselves. This is a picture from the balcony at 27,500 feet. It was absolutely stunning weather. You can see the curvature of the earth, and it was one of the most pristine climbing days I'd ever experienced. This is another picture of one of my fellow teammates coming over a little ridge onto the runway leading up to the south summit. And once again, we had pristine weather conditions, and we had most of the mountain to ourselves. Now, as we were going up, there were people that had summited that were passing us on the way down. And this is a picture that I'd seen numerous times in books and movies. And essentially, this is from the top of the South Summit, and this is the Cornice Traverse leading up to the summit. And when you get to this point, you know that you will actually summit Mount Everest. And here's a picture of the Hillary Step. This is a notorious bottleneck, but what you can see in this picture is that most of the climbers are coming down. The only people that were going up was our team. We're the last team of the day, and there's no one behind us, which meant that eventually when we got to the summit, we had the summit all to ourselves. We had a glorious 30 minutes in fantastic blue weather to enjoy the summit. Predictably, however, because we summited so late in the day, the weather started turning bad. And you can see just 30 minutes later, we were essentially in whiteout conditions. I was physically exhausted, and I was also emotionally exhausted at that point in time. And all I wanted to do was make it back home. Coming down over the Hillary Step, you can see that there's a dead body in the middle of the screen, and right over there. And this was an American climber from Utah who passed away on his way down from the summit. And I would tell you that that was a moment that gave me a lot of pause for several reasons. For one, I was faced once again directly with death, someone who had just died not so long ago. I was faced with really poor weather, and I had to navigate a really narrow traverse across an area with exposure of 5,000 feet on one side into Nepal and 5,000 feet into China on the other side. And this is really where I focused on my breath, much like I do when I'm operating and I'm in a really stressful moment. I took several deep breaths. I became very present and very in the moment. And I was able to navigate the Cornice Traverse and made it to the South Summit. Descending was one of the hardest things I had to do. And the weather was really bad. My oxygen mask wasn't working properly because the valve where you breathe out of was clogged with snow and ice. And I finally stumbled back into camp. And this is a picture I took when I got back to high camp. And I was, once again, physically and emotionally exhausted. And I had mixed emotions. I was thrilled that I had reached the summit of Everest, something I dreamed about for such a long time, something that was in question, especially when I had those rib fractures. But I had a hard time balancing that against all the fresh death that I saw. On the way down from the summit, we passed a lot of people who were coming down as we were going up, and they had just stopped and they had sat along the side because they had no energy left. And you know that those people were going to be casualties on the mountain. And on that year, 11 people died on Everest, most of them at high altitude. And it took me a while to kind of process what was happening. I was the second one on my team to make it back to high camp, and unfortunately, everyone else made it back safely. And over the next 2 days, we went from high camp back to base camp. And during those 2 days of hiking down, I really gave a lot of thought as to why people die trying to achieve this goal. I made it back to base camp, and ultimately I made it back to Ann Arbor. And when I got to Ann Arbor, I experienced something I didn't really expect to experience. I thought I'd be celebrating and it would all be happy. But I have to believe that I had experienced some post-traumatic stress disorder. And once again, a stressorizer is something that is outside the normal realm of human experience. And I think walking by fresh, dead bodies certainly qualifies for that. I wouldn't call them nightmares, but when I'd go to sleep, I would think about the summit and climbing on Everest, not in a positive way, but I'd think about all the death that I saw on the way. And I really had to resort back to those old skills that I had applied when I had the complication and also when I had my depression to kind of snap out of this. I tried to find meaning in the whole experience once again. And I was fortunate enough to have a community that could understand me. This time, this community were my teammates from my climb. We were scattered all over the world. One person was in New Zealand, another person was in Norway, some in America, but we kept in touch. And not surprisingly, they experienced similar things. And with the support of my community and also the institution, giving me time to come back before I had to come back to work, I was able to kind of get out of this funk that I was in. I faced many stresses in my professional and personal life. And without the effective tools to deal with these challenges that I faced, I don't think I would have developed the resilience that I currently have. I think my ability to summit Everest was directly related to the resilience that I developed in my life. I was really fortunate to have support systems and family, friends, community, and my workplace. And because of that, I was able to develop this resilience, but I fully recognize that not everyone has this. Many physicians don't have the support of their institution and don't have colleagues they can turn to. And this results in such a high rate of PTSD, burnout, and depression, over 50% by some reports. I think it's critical that we as healthcare professionals equip our residents and our colleagues with the resources to effectively cope with the stresses that they'll see in their career and their lives. This will not only make them successful professionally, but hopefully personally, it will make them successful as well as it has for me. I'll leave you with one last thing. I think that the concept of work-life balance is something that is often talked about or mentioned, but not really applied to life. And one of the things I learned from this whole experience is that that work is really important, and we're really privileged to have the job we have. But if you survey retired surgeons, they're not going to say they wish they worked more, they wish they did more cases or had more money. All of them will uniformly say that they wish that they spent more time with their family or exploring hobbies that they had. So I think we should also emphasize to our trainees the importance of work-life balance. Thank you very much for taking the time to listen to me.